This episode of Simulation Nation is brought to you by Avcon Incorporated, your one-stop shop for everything standardized patient and wearable simulator.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Simulation Nation. Today we are going to be talking about a lot of the changes that are happening inside of the standardized patient world in simulation. So recently there's been a lot of updates and a lot of things that are kind of shifting and moving in terms of terminology, accreditation, different things like that. So we're going to be talking about what these definitions are, kind of giving a brief overview, and then discussing where the different associations and accreditations and endorsements and all of that kind of live to give clear definitions of kind of what's happening and also our takes on the situation.
I mean, I think it's a really exciting time.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that human simulation is the new term now, right? I mean, Nate may even need to change our intro because we termed standardized patient, but it seems like it's getting kind of a broader term.
Yeah.
But I think that is getting a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And it's something that we've kind of been beating that drum for a very long time.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously not by ourselves, but we are really getting noticed by a lot of the associations that are involved in healthcare simulation. So, again, exciting times for us.
I just want to share a little bit of my bugaboo here, my frustration. But I don't feel like the sim techs or the sim operations, I feel like that was the only change that has happened in their terminology of like how we refer to the operation side of simulation. I feel like there was a big change where like when everyone started, it was sim tech and that was kind of all we had. And then it changed over, I don't even know, maybe a few years ago, I'd say in recent years, to operations. And so everyone kind of changed everything over. So rather than it just being like, oh, that's my sim tech, that's our sim ops. And it entailed everything because it wasn't just technology. It was the whole operations behind the sim center.
Which is what they do.
100%.
And a technician's, you know, like base salary is going to be very different than an
and it was very
person,
limiting
right?
to what they were
Right.
doing. So 100%,
Exactly.
It was a needed change. All for the change, love the change. I feel like in the world of human simulation and serious patient, it is like every other month I'm hearing of a new term or a new definition or a new opinion on how it should be talked about. And I don't understand how there is so much deviation of what it is. And I don't know why, where the two positions, like again, because you think of operations, you think of like, let's just say, I'm going to use old terminology here, but like standardized patient educator, right? You think of those two terms, and it's like, why is it that the two additional terms inside of sim, and then you think of the term simulationist, that came about and has not flux. It's facilitator, simulationist, somewhere in there, right? But why is it in this world there is so much opinion? I think that's where it bothers me, where it's like it just depends on the flavor of the sim center. It just depends on who's the person behind it, of what they call it. And so we started with standardized patient. I don't, what did we even call them in the early days?
Simulated participants, because that's what ASPE had put out as.
But what about
term.
like early days of like our time in terms of like when you were first starting and you were just starting, like were they just actors?
I didn't know the term was standardized patient
I know.
until probably a year into things. But we didn't use that term standardized. I think we
But did
called
you
them
just
live
use the-
role players or something.
Okay,
to
yeah,
that
that's
effect.
what I mean. So like live role players, right? Like early days, what were you just starting to be like? I've heard it as like, especially if you go back to like early literature, it could be like live role players, actors, theater participant, like, you know what I mean? It was very vague because no one knew what to call them, right? Then,
but there's also international, like the lexicon internationally was simulated participant.
well, so then I feel like then we got into,
Well, it was actually in the literature before my time, but I just didn't know it was.
Okay.
Right. So just
So-
in deference to them, like standardized patients and simulated participants have been in the literature since about the 1960s.
okay. And I feel like standardized patient though was very coined by the medical term or
yes.
medical lens.
Because that's really where it kind of erupted from. Right?
Yes, it was the medical lens. Then we had simulated participant. We've had simulated people. We've had simulated patient. We've had like the simulated family members. I've heard of people who just call them acting support, like things like that. You know, but it's like the terminology, I just feel like it's like such an array of what it is that we're calling them or talking about or whatever it is. And I don't understand why in our world this seems to be such a challenge. But now they've basically come out with, okay, everybody feels a little bit differently. There's all of these different nuanced in terms of definition or preference or whatever it may be. So basically, the new term has been called human simulation to be kind of that general umbrella over everything. So basically, it's like, no, we're not going to get into the nuance. We're not going to get into the detail of what any of it is. But human simulation is any time there's a person inside of the simulation experience. So that can be role play, it can be peer-to-peer, it can be faculty and student, it can be a trained actor, it can be the full gamut, and it's not discipline specific. Because I think that that's where they're really trying to go with this, is oftentimes it is discipline specific of how they're looking at it, and they're trying to make it so we're just covering everything, and we're going to use a blanket statement.
When you say we, who is that we?
I believe it's SSH, but I'm not 100% sure who was first, because there's SSH and there's ASPE. But ASPE is literally the Association of Simulated Participant Educators.
Well, actually, they've changed it.
Oh my gosh.
It's actually Association of SP Educators. So they don't
define
they
it
don't
now.
define what SP stands for,
Okay.
because it could be simulated participant, it could be standardized patient. But
now
they have an
they
accreditation
have, that is human simulation.
in human simulation.
Human
Right.
simulation. So again, I don't know if it was ASPE and I don't know if it was SSH. I don't know who put out human simulation first. But the first time I started hearing about it regularly, because again, I will say at this point, when people are coming out with a new term inside this little area, I don't really give it a lot of clout until I start hearing it a lot, because it's one of those like, yeah, okay, here's the newest term. Okay, here's the newest thing. This does seem to now have legs where, again, people are changing job titles, they're changing, email signatures, LinkedIn things, all of that. So again, that's great. Love to see it. I don't know who was the first though, but it did come out once this accreditation component was released. So inside of the term human simulation, they're now breaking it out into different veins. So basically what they're saying is, and again, this is interpretation. I feel like this is kind of like when...
Well, it's hot off the presses too, so it could
Yeah,
change.
and I feel like everyone's figuring it out, right? But I kind of feel like this is like, again, when Protestants all like read the Bible and were like, okay, this is my definition of it. And so then it's kind of like they had 65 different SKUs because like one person read this a little bit different than this person. Like that's kind of how I feel with these definitions, where now it's kind of like, well, here's this minor little thing that we're going to call that, and this is a minor little change here. So what I can read from it, my interpretation, so again, this is no official opinion, this is just a Megan Weldon opinion here, but
you are an SP expert.
well,
So
I
you don't
just
give yourself
like
enough
again,
credit.
this is not representation of an association. This is just me. How I take it though is that standardized patient, they're trying to say, is much more of a OSCE scripted, summative simulation experience. Simulated patient is much more of a formative simulation experience. It doesn't say that in the definition. Like the definition,
When you're saying where are you looking?
the definitions that SSH has put out.
Okay.
So in the
In the
definitions,
dictionaries.
it is not in,
It's
not
not
all
in
in
the
the dictionaries.
Okay.
Some are in the
Sorry.
dictionaries, and they refer to it. So during the accreditation, inside of the SSH accreditation, some of it has a little asterisk and says, as referred to in the SSH dictionary. But not all of these definitions,
Okay.
I believe, are currently
So
in
you
there.
are getting this from the new hot off the presses accreditation standards that SSH has just posted on their website.
Yes.
Okay.
So that is where
Let's all be clear about where you're
Okay,
getting
yes,
this from.
this is, and again, it's like you said, this could all change. But from my understanding, because it doesn't say that.
say historically that has been what has been in the literature.
And I feel like that's been kind of
That's what everybody wants us to believe.
I feel like it's the, like, yeah, it's the, like, maybe if you want to, like, it's kind of like when you're trying to get your kid to, like, eat their vegetables. It's like, they're very suggestive. That's how it feels. It's very suggestive. So no one's really willing to put the line in the sand and be like, no, we're calling this, that simulated patient is formative, and we're calling standardized patient summative. but it's suggested, it's insinuated, it's leaned towards. So
Okay.
that's where I'm kind of just going to take that as what they want and what we're going, you know what I mean? Like that is what the associations are saying. Like that's our recommendation and that's what we're leaning towards. I did hear that recently from University of Tennessee, Knoxville, that they said we call them simulated participants because we are formative. So that's why, and it was the first time I've ever heard someone in a presentation say, we call them this because of a evaluation tool of the simulation. But so then my question would be, okay, so if you work at an IPE center and you have summative and OSCE style sim, and you also have formative sim with nursing or EMT or whatever, are they called different things depending on what sim they're in?
Different people, right?
Yeah, is it different people? Like
is
this is our standardized patient pool, this is our simulated patient pool. I don't know. Are they called standardized patient when they're working at the med school, but then they're called simulated patient when they're working at the nursing school?
I don't know.
What about an
question.
IPE? Does it just depend on what that sim is? Is the sim formative? Is the sim summative? What if the sim summative for one group, formative for another
You
group?
are really jazzed up about this today.
Where do we go? I don't know.
Well,
I just think it's
This is what I'm going to say. I did an article with Jill Sanko and 2 other authors, I can't remember who they were, about the fact that there wasn't enough consistency in the literature. And what that causes is if you are an educator and you are going to Ovid or wherever you're going, PubMed, to look up, every time you write an article, you have these keywords that you put in. But if everybody's writing different keywords, nobody can find the body of research that's been out there, right? There's very, very, very little research on the best way to educate SPs and how to get SPs prepared or human simulation for that human simulation, right?
Participants in human simulation.
Yes, participants in human simulation, live role players, whatever you want to call them. But you know, if there is a simulation that is done with a human simulation experience, as a human simulation experience, we can gather 10 or maybe 15 articles, but there might be a whole lot more if we just Googled. I can remember doing stuff with standardized patient and then learned that in Europe and Australia and maybe even in Asia, they call them simulated participants. So then when I Googled that, or when I at the time PubMed or Ovid, that just opened up a whole nother body.
Well, and I think that's the struggle, is that it also, I feel like part of the issue is that there's a lot of times where it's like we can't get good data points, we can't get good research because everyone keeps being like, well, I do it slightly different, so it doesn't apply to me, or I do it this way, so it doesn't. Like, I feel like no one's willing to be like, yes, we can, there's so much nuance, right? Like, again, let's take it back to the sim ops. There's so much nuance with sim ops. If you work at a community college, a university, a huge sim center that's independent, IPE center, a nursing school, like, there's going to be nuance and difference all throughout that, right? But we can all agree that best practice, or, you know what I mean, all of these different things applies to sim ops in a fairly wide sweeping range, right? Even though there's so much nuance. I'm confused, or I don't necessarily understand why inside of standardized patients, SPs, there is so much of this like, well, that's how they do it over there, but I do it this way. And so now I'm in a different field. And I do think it's hard too, because a lot of times what I'm hearing more frequently now is people are trying to term bringing in patients who actually are patients. So let's just say they are someone who is elderly
and has a history of cardiac disease.
Exactly. They want to bring them in, and they're like, no, you're not playing a role, you're not playing a character, you're just you, and we're going to have you play you. And they're calling that a standardized patient. And that gets also confusing, because it's like, well, that's not going to be the same thing. Like, that situation, there's a lot of things from ASPE standards of best practice that's not going to overlap with that as the concept of them playing themselves, right? Like, there is a lot of stuff with like case development and, you know, like all like standardization and all of these different things that aren't necessarily going to apply in that realm. That, I think, again, it makes it challenging because there's so much like, well, this nuance and that nuance and this nuance.
Well, right. And if you ask Deborah Nestel, their term is expert patients.
Okay.
That's the term for someone like I know UMass Boston has people that are formerly drug addicted come in and do a simulation with their learners, just for them to, again, see social determinants of health, and people, like, hearing from people who have been
See,
in these
that's where I
situations.
struggle, though, or I guess it's not clearly defined, is that a simulation, though? Because if they're going in and it's the person presenting as themselves, they're going through, like, maybe intake, but you know what I mean? Like, they're not going through the same thing. And a lot of the objectives are based around it just being like, you're going to just interact with this person and gain empathy and understanding, but without really, like, you're going to assess lung sounds, you're going to assess airway of the patient. Like, you mean, like, when it's less objectives that are like, let's walk them through the flow of this.
Well, you're thinking about critical thinking and, like, basically, like, identifying cues, performing interventions, and actually looking at, reevaluating whether those interventions worked, right? So it's a little different, right?
Yeah,
it's
like, I've
nuanced.
seen,
but I think that the where it fits in the simulation center is it is an active learning experience, right?
Okay,
And so I think that it is, it may not necessarily be, if you looked at the exact term or the exact definition of simulation, but I think it is more working on developing empathy, understanding how social determinants of health impact, what the epidemic of addiction, and how that impacts people's lives, and I think that, it's always kind of like they have an addiction, they have a problem, but that person could have been a mom who got in a car accident and had, back injury, and like that, just understanding the humanity behind these people, right? But I think that that for the most part, even if it is somebody with a cardiac disease, so they can hear abnormal, cardiac sounds, the definition of simulation would have to definitely be looked at to say whether it fits.
Because I see it as very similar to, like, because I've seen a lot too where people are using, empathy trainers for, like, there's things that they can wear that gives them empathy for what it's like when they're older.
Empathy belly and stuff like that.
Or like, again, the hearing voices simulation and things like that.
Yeah.
And I always see that as kind of a different skew. Like, it's kind of like other, you know what I mean? It's like if you're looking at simulation, it's kind of like,
experience.
that fits over in this other category.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I've always seen it. But again, I just go back to the fact that I think it's so hard to create research, bodies of literature, all of these things when we are so divided. Now, I think that's the goal.
Was exactly what my article with Jill and everybody else said, is like, we have got to come together on this.
And I think that is the goal. We can't
get a good body of literature on it.
I think that is the goal with human simulation. Because I think what they're saying is, it's like, if we can all agree on human simulation as the big giant umbrella, well, at least then we can start collecting, and then you determine, is that article applicable or is it not, right? And so then I think that the concept of it being like, okay, let's just all agree that this is going to be the large umbrella term. So in terms of progress, I feel like we've taken one step closer to be like, okay, we've got one overarching term that at least I know ASPE and SSH are agreeing on. I don't know about an Axel. Hopefully they can get on board. But at least they can agree and say, okay, we're going to call it human simulation, which hopefully will then equate to getting that body of research and things along those lines moving. And I kind of feel like at the end, all of the other nuanced definitions inside of that will work its way out. Like, it's kind of just like, well, it's it's a tomorrow situation.
The most exciting thing from all of this is that two of the associations that are, part of the healthcare simulation world have released that they are doing some type of certification with people that are doing human simulation. So the ASPE Standards of Best Practice came out in 2017, and there really hasn't been a whole lot since then about the idea of SPs or human simulation. And so to hear that two of these associations are now coming out with this is really exciting, because...
But accreditation, not certification, right? Because certification would fall under CHESI A.
Well, it is accreditation, but what I'm saying is, like, they use slightly different verbiage, so I don't want to fall into that. But there's basically an assessment that is done of a sim center that is doing simulation with SPs or human simulation, right? And live what did you say the right? Because we don't want to use the term human simulators. We feel that is really an inappropriate way to refer to a individual.
Participants in human simulation.
Participants in human simulation.
Megan Weldon. That's what I'm terming it as. I don't know.
She got quoted once on
I don't want to add this more.
And just loved that she got quoted.
I just don't want to add this more and more confusion.
Right.
That is what I'm calling it.
But again, the idea that there are people that are looking at this that are very credible. Yeah. In the industry and now saying, hey, let's help you.
What I really appreciate too is that they are saying, hey, there is a difference for human simulation than any other modality.
Exactly.
Right? They're not saying, hey, we need to individualize this, but they're saying, hey, when you're including any type of live person inside of simulation, whether that be faculty, role play, serialized patients, whatever it is, simulated participant, it's the fact that anytime that's going to happen, you need to make sure you're doing it right because it's another live person. We've always said this, that it's like when you're doing sim and now you have another live person, that psychological safety is no longer just for the learner. There's also psychological safety
and physical safety
for the SP that have to be factored in. You can't just ignore that. It's another factor. You've agreed to that when you agreed to have that live person.
Right.
So I do think that now that they're saying, okay, there's an additional component. So what we know, SSH did just release their new accreditation standards. So that is out now, and that is live. That is hot off the press, new, coming out.
Megan's got it over here by the
computer. I do, to reference it just in case. So we do have that. And we know that there are they're going through new definitions, and then there's also different domains that are basically saying, hey, this is what we're checking. So what we know is that there is SSH's base accreditation, right? So that has been out. Their core accreditation, that has been out for a little while now, a few years. Yep. So people are going through that, and again, they have accreditors on their staff or on their team. They're not staff members, but they're on their team. And so we just talked to Jared. He was an accreditor for a while, and basically,
so anybody that's on their accreditation committee is versed in doing this.
Okay. Thank you for correcting that. Yes. So we do know that they have them. They're going out. And then now what they're adding is the base and then the selection of 4 different areas where you can basically specialize in is kind of
it's always been core plus 1.
Okay.
But core plus 1 meant you could do core plus assessment, core plus teaching and evaluation, or core plus research. But now it could be core plus human simulation.
Yeah.
So you can select that one as your additional piece. Yeah. Right.
And so they're now going in and going to look at your program and basically your human simulation program to evaluate if it's hitting on these standards, going through and saying, like, are you doing these different pieces and components?
And as a person who's going through the accreditation process, if you select that, then you are writing, you're presenting to the accreditors how you meet those standards, right? And then they're just like, everybody's on the same page. This is what we're looking at. This is what we've done. They're taking a look at what you've done. Yeah. When we went through the accreditation process, obviously this wasn't available, and we went through core plus teaching and evaluation. But they did, as the SP, the director of SP education, they did pull me aside and say, "Hey, tell me about what's going on."
Yeah.
They did ask to speak to our a few of our SPs to make sure, even though there wasn't any standards on it, because we were doing that, they wanted to see our policy and procedure manual, right? Yeah. So there still was some look at it, but this is just formalizing the fact that if
and
you
giving
have
you something to work off of, which I think is helpful to say
exactly.
This is what we're looking at. I also think that it's going to give us a lot of good data points to see who's selecting this +1 and how is that modality growing inside of simulation.
Yeah, it's pretty popular so far.
That's what I'm excited about, is I think that it is a really exciting time because, again, I am obviously all for live people inside of simulation, but I love this because now it's like, no, we're going to do good sim. This isn't just going to be like, okay, grab someone from the hallway and bring them in and let's have them a part of it. It's like, no, you need to have your due diligence, you need to have your training, you need to emphasize psychological safety. So I think what we're going to see in terms of data points and things like that back to know, this is what people are doing, this is how it's growing, and this is what we're seeing in the industry. I think that's also going to be a very helpful point for research to know what that looks like. So and
I also say, if you are accredited, right, is as an educator who, you know, that was something that we would work with, is to say that, like, you do have to be considerate of SP safety, right? But we didn't have anything to point to. But once you become accredited or going through accreditation, you have that wherewithal to be able to say, we are going through accreditation on this. These are the standards that we must follow, right? So it's not, it really, for people who haven't gone through accreditation, I just hope you hear this, because it's such an important piece, is that you now get to advocate for the things that you need in your sim center to do good sim, right? And that to me, who doesn't want to go through accreditation if you think about it from healthcare? Who doesn't want to follow best standards, right? But if your dean is willing to pony up the investment in resources to go through that accreditation process plus pay for it, they are going to support you in the things that you need in order to do good sim. And I think that is a really big factor, is that the accreditation committee is there to, yes, check you, but they're more so there to advocate for you and to be that kind of like, here's the stake in the ground, and we need to stick to these standards. And so even when they're not there on scene, no, we've been accredited, and these are the standards that we are expected to follow, which I think speaks miles to really, again, putting the stake in the ground for human simulation and making it so much more valuable for the learners.
And I think that a lot of that, and I think that a lot of that does go back to reframing how you're looking at it versus it's like, okay, I'm going in to be graded, or, you know, whatever that is.
Well, and that was my mindset until I got there, and they're like, how can we help you? And I'm like, oh, you're here to help? You know, rather than like you're under an examination. It's really like, what can we help? Like, what are your needs? What are the things that are going to help you do better? Because obviously, as someone who was fully invested in the process, I'm going to be able to see where there's holes, right? So, you know, advocating for those things, and that just, again, it gives you that opportunity to point back to the standards. These are the standards. This is what we're accredited for. And again, people, because every healthcare institution that does education, and even every healthcare institution has to be accredited, right? You have to go through an outside look at what you're doing. They understand that yes, you need to hold to those standards even when the accreditors aren't in the house.
Well, and I think that that's the part too, where it's like, if you start getting challenges like increased enrollment and budget cuts and, you know, like all these different things, you then have the backing of the standards to say, okay, but this is now what I need then to uphold the standards that I already have, right? And so again, I think that the investment in it is not just for a grade or for like the final check mark, but it is also for you to be able to advocate and improve. So I just want to go through what the different domains are here. So we have activities with human simulation.
Okay, so let's just say very specifically, SSH has listed this, and we've said that a few times. ASPE does not really have on their website what their standards are that they're looking for. If you apply, I'm sure you'll get that information. So we can only speak now to what SSH has on theirs. Again, ASPE is the ones that have released the standards of best practice in 2017. So I'm sure that it ties back to that. I know that with this accreditation, it does say that they look that SSH is looking also at the ASPE standards of best practice that have been published.
Just put anything for accreditation on ASPE on a shelf right now. We're not talking about them. We're only talking about SSH for right now.
Because we can only speak to the fact that they have it.
So for inside of SSH's accreditation, inside of the human simulation +1 section, it has human simulation activities, human simulation education design, qualified human simulation educators, human simulation training, human simulation evaluation and improvement. So generally, it does tie back to what we're looking at with the standards from ASPE, but it does give bullet points then underneath of it to look at it. I would encourage anyone who is using live people in simulation in any capacity to review these accreditation domains to kind of see where you are. I think that that's helpful to see, like, okay, what are we doing? Even if we're not going for accreditation, let's just review it and look at it to see, yes, this is where we're filling this need, this is where we're filling this need. I do think that it's helpful to do kind of a self-evaluation to look at that. Because it does give us a good measuring tool, right? It gives us a good ability to say, okay, this is what SSH is saying. Let's evaluate it.
Yeah, and I will say that, so let's say you've already been through the core plus teaching and evaluation. If you want to go just through the human simulation piece of it, you can go back and get that single piece.
Yeah.
Or research or assessment,
Yeah.
any of them.
Yeah.
So you can go back through this piece of it. But I also want to say that I do think when standards are provided, it gives you the idea that, okay, here's where the line is, right? And we want to try to get above the line. I remember when the ASPE released their first standards of best practice, and we were so excited, right? We ran to it right away and looked at it, and by and large, we had pretty much implemented almost everything in there. There was two things. One was we didn't have a code word for if the SP felt unsafe. And I remember that was something that we had to start. We obviously had pretty good communication, but in the middle of a simulation, if something were to happen.
Yeah.
And then the second one was that we didn't do a pilot simulation. And I don't know why, because Healthcare Standards of Best Practice had this on there as well. But I don't know if I just fell asleep when that happened.
Yeah,
but
ASPE was called a dry run.
Yes.
And NAXL called it a pilot. But it was the same concept of doing a run-through before the simulation happened. So basically, in the summer, run through the scenario, find the holes, find the pitfalls, and then you'll be better prepared when you actually run
this
it.
isn't the dress rehearsal. The dress rehearsal is something you do like a week before the sim or somewhere in there, and you're practicing that sim. But that's for like a fully vetted sim that you've probably been doing. I will say for me, it took 3 semesters of running the simulation till I felt as though we had it fully vetted, right? Where we had everything that we needed. Yeah. So you don't make any changes in the middle of the semester, but at the end of the semester, we would always take notes and make any changes. And obviously, less notes came. But if you do this dry run or this prior to, you've got the simulation written, you have experienced SP that comes in and, takes a look at the character development. We run through the simulation. That's where you identify where learners are going to be messed up. And what we would do is typically try to get learners that were a semester ahead or a year ahead of the students that we were going to put through the program, because they had already had the learning content and things along those lines. And we found, once we started doing that, we really found some simulations that we needed to make adjustments and changes to, and before the simulation started. So it just led to better outcomes in the first semester.
But even just from an operation standpoint, it'd be like, where's the blood pressure cuff?
Right.
Where's the pulse ox?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Oh, we forgot that we actually are going to need that wristband or whatever, right? Like, it was just even the fact of just, like, logistically
getting everything together.
So rather than on the first day of the sim, you're running around frantic, it was like, oh, no, we know that we need that, which, again, it was like one of those, like, I don't know, that's a great idea. Don't know why we didn't think of that, but great idea. So right now, SSH, with their accreditation, they have put through one cohort, which is 3 different schools. They are in their second pilot right now. And then I believe after the second pilot is when they're planning on doing their full release of, again, kind of like opening it up more to the masses. But right now they have that second pilot going through. And ASPE right now.
So kind of like a simulation where they ran through the first part. They found out what they needed to make changes or adjustments to, and then they're running through their second one. Yeah.
And so then now ASPE has released something very similar. It's one word difference. I don't want to go through and say it because I know I'm going to butcher it here, but it's very similar. It's just ASPE's Human Simulation Accreditation and SSH's Human Simulation Accreditation.
Accreditation in Human Simulation is ASPE's, and SSH's Human Simulation Accreditation.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. So
I think it's just something like that.
Very similar, but ASPE is releasing their first decisions.
Cohort.
Yeah, well, like, decisions on the application. So basically they've had open application that closed it closed in March, and then now they are releasing the decision to the participants, to the applicants, on April 30th. So that should be coming out very soon.
We don't know if they've run through any pilot programs before this, but this is the first.
I believe this is their first pilot. This is their first release. This is their first people.
Yeah.
So this is the first time this is going through. So in terms of the difference, we don't really know cost-wise what this is going to look like from ASPE side of things. They have never done an accreditation before, so things are a little more gray of how this is all going to shake out and how the two are going to speak to each other. Again, we can clearly understand because SSH has already had their base accreditation with the 3 options. So it's a little easier to understand that this is just now an additional offering with the 3 that they've previously had. So it's easier to understand how this is going to all shake down, and it's easier to understand price point. But when it comes to SSH, this is their first time doing any type of accreditation. So it's a little harder to understand exactly.
ASPE.
Oh my gosh. Okay. When ASPE put out their accreditation, it's a little harder to understand how that's going to flow and what that process is actually going to look like. So with that, we're kind of still waiting to see what this result's going to look like, how they're going to be presenting this. I'm sure it's going to come up at their conference in June, but basically we're kind of waiting to see how this is going to be unveiled.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was first presented last year as like, hey, we're
opening it.
Yeah. But I wasn't there, so I don't know
Yeah.
what was presented.
Yeah. And so then I think this year it's kind of going to be like, okay, these were the accepted applicants. We're now going to open it up again, but I think we'll kind of start to see how this is going to work. And I'm curious to see how the two are going to blend. Like, I'm not really sure how these two things are going to, how are they going to, what's going to be their differentiators? What's going to be where
I think,
this
again,
is
I think if
differentiator, this is SSH's.
Yeah. I mean, again, from my perspective, being a part of both associations, I think that if people have already gone through the SSH accreditation, they're probably going to stick to the SSH accreditation. But if it's a med school and they're very involved in ASPE, they're going to work through that. I don't think people are going to need both. I think they're going to just make a decision about which one works best for them.
Yeah. And I do think that it's harder with, I know ASPE is not technically medical, but they definitely lean more towards that medical side of simulation. And I think SSH leans much more toward an interprofessional side and approach to it. So I do wonder how that's going to kind of play out in terms of what that looks like.
I will say historically, I mean, ASPE was started by medical. I mean, they had to go through the OSCEs. So it was medical GME educators, and they got together to make sure that, they had collaboration, I guess, amongst the SPs, and, to help elevate the SP experiences for their med students. So that's really how it got started. Again, they still meet the needs of other disciplines, but it's predominantly that's the roots. But SSH, it was also medical. Its roots. I think it's definitely sprung out a bit more, but it was historically that way. Way back in the day.
I do think that it's, for me though, what I look at a lot in terms of even the past 5 years, and I understand that in healthcare sim, the last 5 years is a good chunk of their history, right? Or the growth history of it all. But I do look at who's on the board. And I think that does play a big part into where the association is leaning towards.
Yeah.
When you have a board of people who are all working in medical simulation, I think you're going to lean towards that. I think that it's easier to understand the same way that I worked primarily in nursing. That's going to be my natural lean, is I'm going to lean more towards that discipline because that's what I know the most, right? It's where I naturally operated. So I do think that in terms of making sure there's diversification on the board, I think that's important. I think that's a really important piece, that as they're looking at becoming, fulfilling the needs of all disciplines, you need to also have that say. That's the other thing I want to push as well, is on these decisions that are getting made about human simulation, please consider having someone who has experience of actually being a standardized patient involved in ththese different initiatives. Because I do think that there is a big difference from standardized patient educators who have never been in the bed. That's how I would always call it, is it's have you been in the bed? When's the last time you were actually going through simulation? Because it's a completely different viewpoint than as the educator. As the educator, it is completely different. And I will say that there's few and far between of people who have stayed in the industry as a standardized patient and who has done that role and identifies as that, would call themselves a standardized patient, being involved or ask questions about what's coming up with human simulation and things along those lines. I do think that's where we end up in that tricky territory of terms like human simulator that are not necessarily viewed positively by someone who is a standardized patient. It doesn't feel good to be called a human simulator because, again, it feels dehumanizing.
Very mechanical, yeah.
Feels dehumanizing. It feels like you're a tool. And I think that there's no harm intended with that, but nobody's asking. It's the same thing with the earpieces. I hear people using earpieces all the time. Nobody's going to the standardized patient and saying, hey, let's go through this. Let's chat about this. It's oh no, I think this is the better thing. Let's put that out. And I just implore these associations to have people who've done this for a while, who have some experience, who really love it and really understand it, having their vote or having their say in what's going on. Because I do think that that's also very important, that a lot of times it's easy to make decisions for them or based just on the educator role, but there's also a deeper level from the standardized patient role. So I just think that that's something I would love for them to consider as they continue to move forward.
So Megan, maybe you should start a nonprofit association for standardized patients.
With my 9-month-old and my 3-year-old at home, there's nothing I would love more than my full-time job, plus the podcast, plus everything else that now I'm going to start
if anybody that's listening has the desire to start an association, we've long thought that SPs need their own advocacy group.
Yes.
For sure. Megan can't do it, but she'll
will
help
volunteer a limited amount, as many hours as I have in the day to assist with it. I cannot do it myself. But yeah, I think that this is all really exciting stuff that's coming out. And again, I'm really curious to see kind of how, I feel like a lot of it is like, you can almost see like, I don't know, like the different worlds colliding. And it's kind of like, I don't know how that's going to go together. Or I wonder how those pieces are going to fit. Like, so I think there is a lot of questions right now as things are just kind of starting and building up. And
but
you're
it's
kind
exciting.
of seeing it. It's exciting things. And it's the part that just makes my heart so happy is I just feel like, again, it's the validation that people want to do good simulation. They want to do good human simulation. And now there's actually going to be reference points. Like, to me, it's the same thing as when the standards first came out, of it being like, okay, we're making a step. We're making some progress. We're getting to that next level. And I kind of see this as the same thing, as it's very validating that there is the distinction that, hey, doing mannequin sim, doing VR sim, that's one thing. Doing human simulation is another thing, and we're going to make sure that this is clear and make sure that there's standards. And I just think it's really exciting that there's going to be that representation inside of these huge associations for saying these are the baselines, and like what we were talking about earlier, here's how you advocate for it. And again, we're making sure that it's being done well to represent that industry well. And that's what really just, like, again, it makes me very excited about what's to come. And again, I think we're seeing this in the infancy stages, but it's like, what's the next 3 years going to look like, you know? And I think that there's so much talk right now of AI and concern about, you know, what that's going to do for jobs and how that's going to fit into simulation. I really do believe there's room for all of it. Like, I don't think that it needs to be like, oh, AI is going to consume simulation. I don't think that human simulation is going to consume simulation. I don't think mannequins, but, like, you know, it's like there's place for everybody. It's just figuring out how all these dynamics are going to work in one center. And I think that our last interview with Jared, if you guys haven't listened to it, I encourage you to go back and listen to it. But I think that that's what's encouraging too, is it's like he was talking about, it's like the dance of all the disciplines and how all these things work together. Same thing with the modalities. What's the dance of how all of these things are going to work together? And I think that it's just exciting to see both of these new emerging thoughts coming up without one necessarily needing to beat the other one. It's how do they continue to grow, and where's the space that you're using them in the right form and fashion based off of, honestly, going back to the learning objectives. What makes sense for that? And with AI, how can it assist you, not take over? And I think that's the big balance that everyone's trying to figure out right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I will say that when I took my CHESI exam, when they asked which modality was best, that standardized patients was checked way more than any of the other ones. Yes. So, I mean, again, I will definitely
not biased by
I will
any
definitely
means.
grant that I am biased, but as an educator that had come right from the clinical arena, I saw what I was doing, and I felt as though I was only giving the learners half. And so by including humans in simulation, it made such a big difference for them as far as their outcomes and their development, and their confidence, and all of those things. So I will forever be an advocate of it.
Yeah.
But I also know that, you know, resources are limited. You know, sometimes people cannot get a lot of diverse populations in the areas that they are. Like, so you have to look at the resources you have. You have to look at what modality is best, your level of learner, the objectives, and all those different things to maximize the learner's education. Asking the employers, like, if you guys, for those of you that are listening that work in universities or community colleges, I am sure that your leadership does surveys of the employers that your graduates go to. Find out what the employer's feedback is about your learners. What are the things that you could make improvements on? What are the things that you could make better? Like, at the end of the day, that's going to help inform what you need to do, because they're getting a look at what the output is from your program.
Well, I also think too, viewing it that the student is also a customer of your simulations.
Yeah.
So getting feedback from the students of what did they find valuable, having a sit down with senior level students and going through the simulation curriculum and talking about how did this impact it? What was your favorite? What was your learning outcomes? I think even that's really helpful, and it's a really easy base start. And I think that sometimes people are scared because they're worried about what feedback they're going to get. But I think sometimes they don't realize, like, you're going to hear so many great stories about what happened, and that's going to be your moment. And so I say that a lot in my consulting, where it's like, don't be afraid to find out what it is, because you're going to hear the bad, but you're also going to hear the good. And that's going to give you a lot of
good, right?
Well, and it's like you're going to get a lot of momentum from hearing about these success stories that you've had. I do want to mention it just because we talked about it, but ASPE did put out an infographic, SSH, I'm so sorry. SSH put out an infographic, I want to say a year ago now, but it was a wheel, and it had basically what was the learning outcomes and then what's the appropriate modality.
Yeah, they did.
And that is inside of there where you can reference that. I do think it's a good base point of being able, when you're starting out or trying to learn. Really great infographic to kind of go back to. I encourage people to put it kind of in their policy and procedure, and when they're doing simulation design, to include it in there, because it is a helpful reference tool. It is fairly basic. Again, it's not necessarily super nuanced, but for a basic tool of just being able to reference it, it's helpful, and it helps you know what technologies you do have.
Well, and it supports the decisions you made, right?
Yeah. Wearable simulators are not included, but just know that they are around, that you can use wearable simulators with
We're still going to beat that drum.
human participants that they can wear, and you can merge the best of both worlds between the two. So just know that. But I think that that's helpful in terms of reviewing modalities. So thank you guys so much for joining us on this episode of Simulation Nation. We hope that this offered some insight into some of the changes that are coming out and emerging in recent findings and things that are happening.
Just
and
hot off the press, man.
I think that, again, like 6 months from now, we're going to have to revisit this and kind of go back
100%.
because I think there's going to be some changes and,
It's exciting.
new things coming out. So stick around, and we'll be back next episode.